but I don't think it's an appropriate time or place to do it. I think the size of this meeting and the fact that I've suddenly appeared on the agenda unexpectedly has to tell us a little bit about the impact of an election result in a small Central American country of very little strategic importance, of very little economic power, and of really very little power in any real sense, and yet the impact and the effect of that election result, which for us is particularly ironic, I think, since we are quite rightly sceptical about elections and election results. Nevertheless, this one has had an impact around the world of extraordinary dimension. A couple of days ago, just walking into the university library, a man came up to me, a comrade who I didn't know, of Middle Eastern students. He just came up to me and stopped me and said, why did they accept the result? Why did they do it? Why did they go into the election at all? A couple of questions which I found plainly difficult to answer in the 5 or 10 minutes that were available to us, as you'll understand. And for most of us, I think our starting point is that result is a tragedy. There's no voting to be done. There's nothing in it that can give us any joy or any pleasure. There's no I told you so that we have to offer to anyone. The Nicaraguan election result is a tragedy. It's a tragedy because those who lost that election carried a name and a banner and bore a beacon which, whether or not they betrayed it, whether or not they still represented what it had originally meant, nevertheless they stood in that election as the representatives of a revolution, as the representatives of a mass movement which 11 years ago had overthrown a dictatorship of peculiar brutality and peculiar stability. It had overthrown it, and I'll come back to and talk to you about this a little bit more in a moment. It had overthrown a state with very little in the way of resources, very little in the way of political traditions, with a political leadership that was not only inexperienced but actually unprepared completely to lead the insurrection that eventually rose at the beginning of 1978. And by 1979, over the bodies of 50,000 dead Nicaraguan workers, had overthrown the tyranny of the Somoza. 43 years and looking set to be there forever. Now those who lost the elections on Sunday last, were people who carried that banner and purported to speak in its name. They lost an election in which indisputably, and there's no avoiding it, indisputably, those who voted in the right-wing coalition of UNO were the very people who for 11 years before had carried them forward at the head of a great insurrectionary demonstration. On July the 19th, 1979, it was those people, the people who lost the elections were the very people who had led that great demonstration in Managua those 11 years before. The people who voted in UNO were the people who for 11 years since then have accepted and assimilated and absorbed and been willing to continue to accept a mounting and deepening sacrifice, which is, as in a minute, as I go through the figures, comrades will see how profound, how extensive, and how disastrous those sacrifices really were. 11 years on, despite all those sacrifices, despite an incontrovertible willingness to fight and to struggle to accept those sacrifices and those deprivations, 11 years later, they vote in a coalition called UNO. Now let's begin by looking at who UNO are. They call themselves One. There are 14 organizations who in their entire history, many of them have histories no longer than 2 or 3 weeks, but nevertheless, in their various lengths of histories, have spent most of their time clawing at one another's throats, stealing one another's bank accounts, and undermining one another's drug shipments. These are the kinds of people that are coalescing around a woman who has suddenly come to be called, I noticed in the last few days, a white-haired widow of 60. Well, maybe we should look a little bit at who the white-haired widow of 60 really is and who the people surrounding her. Obviously, as they surround her in a circle, concerned for her health and welfare, to make sure that she can stand up when it's required of her, sit down when it's required of her. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to throw in a joke, it just came up. Anyway, this is Violeta Chamorro. Now, for comrades who have been confused by the crowing of the right for the last few days, I mean, there could have been few days so demoralizing and so hurtful to those of us who are socialists than to see Robert Dole stand up in the US Senate, the leader of the Republican majority in the Senate, and say, well, that's 2 down and 1 to go. The 2 he was referring to, of course, were that CIA factotum, drug runner and gangster, and sometimes murderer, part-time that is, Noriega of Panama, comparing them, of course, with the second of the duo he was referring to, where a Sandinista government brought to power by a popular revolution. The third he was hoping to see go soon, of course, was Cuba. Even Ronald Reagan, with the assistance of a team of scriptwriters, managed to cobble together a two-sentence statement. Managed to cobble together a two-sentence statement which I've actually learned by heart. He didn't, but I can. And it says, the honor is really the conflict, he said, that only goes to show that they were really representing the people all the time. These are the people you'll remember that he referred to in one of his longer statements, 3 sentences this time, a few years ago as the modern-day Maki, the resistance fighters of our time. Now, let's be very clear about who we're talking about. The organizations represented politically in the UNO coalition, a coalition, by the way, which is described with great delight in the press as a coalition of parties of the far left and the far right. Let's just dismiss that very quickly. The far left parties are the PSN, two parties, the PCN, the Communist Party of Nicaragua, which is a peculiar Stalinist excrescence that has emerged in Nicaragua over the last few years. It has no international link. And the PSN, the Socialist Party of Nicaragua, which is effectively, if you like, the official Communist Party, and like most of the other official Communist parties of the world, has discovered that the dictatorship and the proletariat was a terrible idea, and has moved with dramatic speed to the right. Perhaps not surprising for a party which was actually founded by Somoza, and that is ruling at its opening founding rally in 1944. At a theatre, in a place something like this, has the back of the stage decorated with a huge portrait of Somoza. So if I'm skeptical about its revolutionary credentials, maybe that explains why. Those two parties, whose hatred of the Sandinistas and whose unprincipled opportunism led them into coalition with parties they know perfectly well to be parties of the extreme right, can hardly claim to represent any left-wing forces inside that coalition, and they certainly didn't. The other 12 organizations are varieties of right-wing organizations, all of whom in one way or another have been and continue to be sympathetic to the Contras. The Contras, you remember, are a force which is today 12,000 armed people plus a political infrastructure based in Honduras, and which has been, if you like, the further arm of US policy in the region. The Contras are not simply murderers, not simply people who shot people in the back of the head. When they killed people, they did so not only with great delight and in the most prolonged and lengthy manner and in the most sadistic manner. They cut people up when they killed them, and they've not only been doing that for the last 11 years. The last example of their peculiar manner of murder was 3 days before the elections, when they caught and murdered a couple of Sandinistas, dismembered their bodies either before or after their death, we'll never know, and left them lying in public places. Now let's be clear who we're talking about. We're talking about sadistic murderers whose job was not simply to kill people, but to destabilize and undermine the Nicaraguan economy and Nicaraguan society in 2 parallel ways. One, by making the economy unworkable, largely in their border raids, coming over, burning coffee fields, terrorizing the peasantry, attempting not only to stop the harvesting of coffee, which would then die on the trees or be burned, but also to stop its replanting. It was, in other words, an economic instrument, and it was also a political instrument. In the course of making the economy unworkable, it was estimated that they would also murder and terrorize the population. And the evidence of the success of that is the mounting refugee population, which over the last 4 or 5 years has moved towards Managua in numbers probably approaching 500,000, probably about 500,000, in a country whose total population is just under 3 million. An issue which, of course, proved to be economically extremely problematic. So that's who the Contras are. These are the people who are now represented in this coalition of Democrats, this coalition of people who want to build a government of national salvation. They represent the bourgeoisie, which from inside and outside Nicaragua has, since 1979, seen it as its class purpose to undermine and destroy the Nicaraguan revolution. But there are many paradoxes and ironies in all of this, which we can examine in a minute. So, the crowing of the right. is a crime which we can understand, given the people who are now in power. So it must be particularly irksome and particularly difficult for comrades now to look at that coalition of right-wing forces, a coalition of the widow of 60, despite a sequence of increasingly horrible murders over the last 12 months, never once pronounced herself against Contra-activity. Indeed, her immediate ally, the man called Australian Cesar. Now, most American spokesmen, as well as Nicaraguan spokesmen, denied absolutely any connection between UNO and the Contras in the weeks and months before the election. Nonetheless, a letter which was published widely from Alfredo Cesar to the head of the Contra, the General Bermudez, ex-head of Somoza's National Guard, made absolutely clear, in case there were any doubt, exactly what the connections were. Cesar wrote to Bermudez, the head of the Contra, and he said, please, under no circumstances, disband the Contra forces or cease your military activity until the elections are over. So the connections are absolutely clear and completely undeniable. The problem we've got is that given that undeniable heritage and representation of UNO, who they are, where they come from, we have now a difficult task before us. We have to explain why. In the face of that, and this is not specialized knowledge, this is not knowledge that comes from reading between the lines of recondite and obscure American journals. These are people whose histories in Nicaragua are well known and absolutely clear. Yet 52% of the Nicaraguan population, and that can't be explained simply by reference to the small capitalists or the middle classes or the lower middle classes. A very significant proportion in a turnout that was around 70% again, voted for that coalition, knowing exactly who they were. And let's just dispense with one other myth before we go on. The woman, the white-haired, little old widow woman at the front of the UNO coalition, Violeta Chamorro, represented in the world's press, and unfortunately in the world's press, which embraces everything from the Daily Telegraph and the New York Herald Tribune to this week's New Statesman, to which I will return with a couple of vituperative asides in a minute. This woman, who is deemed to be the representative of some kind of liberal, human rights concerned group of people, let's be very clear who she was. She's the widow of a newspaper editor called Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, who was killed in January 1978 by Somoza. He was the editor of a newspaper called La Prensa. La Prensa, which has become a cause célèbre for the right and for social democracy across the world in the last 10 years of Nicaragua's history, since the Sandinistas came to power. And Chamorro was a bitter opponent of Somoza. But he was not a bitter opponent of Somoza from the left. He was not a bitter opponent of Somoza because he felt that Somoza was a significant impediment to the development of the struggle for socialism in Nicaragua. Chamorro belonged to a group of bankers, financiers, and industrialists who felt, quite rightly as it happened, that they were not getting an adequate or an equal share of the cake, which Somoza was rather greedily keeping to himself. And it came to a head particularly when the 1972 earthquake produced millions and millions and millions of dollars in aid to Nicaragua, all of which went into the pockets of Somoza. I could find very few voices saying, this is a disgrace, this is disgusting, this is designed to save the poorest and weakest part of the population. I could find lots of letters and newspaper articles saying, what about a bit for us? And that, essentially, was the line that Chamorro took. Chamorro was a lifelong conservative, and his opposition to Somoza was a squabble within the capitalist family from bourgeois group to bourgeois group. Yes, he was a fierce opponent, and yes, in the absence of any as it were, voices from the left, he became identified with the opposition to Somoza. But when he was killed, around his funeral, a massive insurrection began in the poorest quarters of the town of Masaya. Remember the name, Masaya. Masaya is 40 kilometers from Managua. In Masaya, in January of 1978, the insurrection began, which 18 months later overthrew Somoza. Masaya, on Monday morning, was the only city in Nicaragua where there were street celebrations celebrating the victory of UNO. Maybe, and I believe it is, it was connected with the fact that 3 months earlier, Masaya had seen the biggest demonstration against conscription anywhere in Nicaragua. Bear that in mind, we'll come back to it. But anyway, the insurrection began in the poorest quarter of Masaya, not because Chamorro led it, but because his murder represented and crystallized something of the tyranny of Somoza. And also because 1978 was a time when a deepening world recession hit Nicaragua hardest because it was poorest, because it was weakest, and if you like, where the effects of a world recession bit so deep that the poorest and weakest sections rose up in Nicaragua in what then was a continuous insurrection culminating in July of 1979. But immediately after 1979, Pedro Joaquín Chamorro ceased to be a liberal Democrat. He became an opponent, a bitter opponent of the Sandinista regime. And just to kill that one once and for all, La Prensa was not, you read the newspapers, you read the way people talk about it, you would imagine it's a kind of cross between Le Monde, the New York Herald Tribune, and the Spectator. La Prensa was a larger-sized version of the Sun. It was a vicious, savage, anti-Sandinista newspaper which published day in and day out scare stories, denunciations of peasants taking over land, denunciations of workers who stole from factories, tragedies, disasters, day in and day out. It was a consistent champion of the Contra cause from the moment they were formed. This is what Violeta Chamorro represents in her leadership of UNO. So, the point is, there is no doubt who these people are. Now what then caused the people of Nicaragua, the majority of workers in Nicaragua, knowing that, to vote for them? This is the question we have to answer. And we have to answer it honestly. The New Statesman's leader yesterday is, I think, disgusting is the best word I can think of. What it says, what it argues, and it's funny listening to people over the last few days as they come to terms with the tragedy of the Nicaraguan elections. I don't know what comments will no doubt in the discussion tell us some of the responses there have been, but some of the ones I've heard was, well, Ortega really showed himself to be a true Democrat by accepting the elections. All of us, everybody in the world, I think, has seen that one picture, that tragic photograph of Chamorro and Ortega embracing as one concedes the election to the other, and now, the Chamorro, in the wake of her victory, announces she is uneasy about Contra activity, and she's concerned about national reconciliation. And the New Statesman says, well, perhaps it's a good thing. Perhaps the Sandinistas now will offer themselves to the world with a clean face. If there were doubts before about whether they were democratic, well, let's face it, that democracy has now been proven, and the Sandinistas have proved themselves to be a democratic organization. This, comrades, is not a gathering of liberal Democrats. For a gathering of socialists, there is a terrible and bitter paradox in a proclamation of democracy. After all, the statesman has in years past, like so many members of the Labour left, proclaimed Nicaragua as evidence of a new kind of alternative to socialism. For the last 10 years, we've heard and argued with comrades across the Labour left, with solidarity campaigns who have said to us, with something approaching arrogance, what Nicaragua represented, even amidst its poverty, was a new kind of democracy, something that was beyond and better than socialism, a new kind of popular democracy. They gave it new names, new protagonists. The protagonists were no longer the working class. It was something called the popular classes, or the coalition of popular classes. It wasn't socialism. Socialism as one leader of the Sandinista front after another, and declaration after declaration over the last 10 years told us these words are no longer appropriate. These words belong to another time. But for those who were embarrassed and uneasy about the monoliths of Eastern Europe, Nicaragua offered a new possibility, a new message, a new model. Here was a model of equality, of community democracy, of popular support, of popular government, and sections of the left then got themselves into some peculiar Jesuitical argument about when a workers' government is not a workers' government, what the nature of the government was. But everybody seemed united that this was a government which spoke for and with the voice of the mass of ordinary people through a voice which they had acquired and understood through the organs of popular democracy. How tragic it is then that those people who once told us about a new form of advanced democracy in which the mass of the people became direct controllers and masters and mistresses of their own lives, today, by a terrible and completely unacceptable sleight of hand, now pretend that that democracy, a democracy which we too seek to build, we too understand as the prelude and the threshold to genuine democracy. to authentic proletarian democracy, to socialism. Now, by a sleight of hand, that's turned around. And this bourgeois democracy, this representative democracy in which the protagonist is no longer the mass of people, but parties financed from outside by budgets of millions, using the media and the radio, and reducing those masses, the mass of people to passive spectators of the political process. Now comrades want us to believe that this is the democracy they spoke to us about before. It is not. This is not. This is a step back from what they claimed existed in Nicaragua over the last 10 years. So what drove the Nicaraguan people to vote for evil? I think the answer must be clear. The answer is poverty. The answer is a catastrophic decline in the standard of living of most Nicaraguans. Today, at the beginning of 1990, the purchasing power and the real value of wages in Nicaragua is below that of 1979. Today, in 1988, inflation reached an astonishing and staggering, and actually it's impossible really to understand or imagine what it means, 35,000%. What it meant was that the wage you had in January 1988 bought you, the wage you had in December of 1988 bought you less than 10% of what it might have bought you in January of the same year. It meant that people were hungry. It meant that people were going on without absolute essentials for months and months and months at a time. It meant that as the war deepened and continued and extended, the economic situation was such that from February 1988, the last and, if you like, the most brutal of economic plans, continuing up to this very moment, meant the removal of subsidies on basic food. So not only did inflation eat into the value of the wages that you earned, but even with what you had to buy goods whose prices were rising through the roof as the market. Yes, the market proved its real concern and consideration for the mass of ordinary people by ensuring that the price of the most basic commodities shot through the ceiling. At the same time, and you see, the problem for us is that I hope that the conclusion of what I'm going to say will not be pessimistic, but we have to be realistic. We can't conceal what has happened over these last few years. We have to understand it, confront it, and understand it. And the realities are these, that the Nicaraguan population, the massive Nicaraguan population, suffered a catastrophic decline in their living standards. And it is not over the last 3 months, but over the last 6 or 7 years. A catastrophic decline which meant that the value of wages slashed, which meant that those banners of the work and promise of the Nicaraguan Revolution, health, the revolution in education, new housing, the foundations of a minimal welfare state which were laid in 1979 and 1980, and which throughout the last decade have been offered to us as evidence of what is most positive, what is most fulfilling, and the continuing living promise of the Nicaraguan Revolution. The realities, comrades, are slightly different and a great deal more painful. The realities are that those social programs from 1982 onwards were slashed and slashed and slashed again. The austerity program of 1988, which cut the public spending program to an absolute minimum, was only the last in a series of steps. Some tragic statistics in Nicaragua. For example, illiteracy in 1980-81 cut to 12% in a wonderful and inspiring literacy campaign that all the world spoke about. Today, illiteracy is back up again, beyond 30%. Why? For very complicated reasons. Partly because no resources have been available to back up the literacy campaign. Partly because more and more youngsters have become increasingly alienated and disillusioned and have not gone to school and have seen the literacy campaign as part of a different, a more manipulative process of state control. All of these things enter into it. So public spending is cut. The hospitals are collapsing. The schools are closing. Illiteracy is rising again. Infant mortality, perhaps the most poignant and the most central measure of a developing health system. Infant mortality has risen again in the last few years, where it has been progressively reduced in the first 4 or 5 years of the decade. These are the realities of Nicaragua. Against that background, even in and of itself, it would hardly be surprising that there would be a general disillusion. Beyond that, there is what I suppose we can describe as war weariness. War weariness because 40 to 50,000 people have died in the fighting against the Contras. In a country of 3 million, there are no families, not a single family in the country which doesn't have somebody who has died, somebody who's been wounded, somebody who's crippled or injured for life as a result of the war against the Contras. 62.5% of the national budget last year was devoted to defence spending. That 62.5% was, of course, gathered at the expense of public spending, at the expense of the defence of the social gains of the revolution in the first couple of years, and at the expense of the working class. An expense which led not only to cutbacks in living standards, but also to major redundancies in the public sector, 20,000 in 1988, 17,000 in the state sector in 1989. And just to put this thing in proportion, I mean, those redundancies, direct redundancies out of the state sector, are 2% of the economically active population. This is a major and dramatic blow that affects everyone. But the other thing that we have to confront, the most difficult part of it all perhaps, is that those burdens, those sacrifices, we know who was responsible. We know that the American government, the American imperialism chose from the outset to strangle and undermine the Nicaraguan revolution by cynically manipulating its power in the international aid agencies, by cynically employing these gangs of murderers to make life so unbearable, so intolerable for the majority of Nicaraguans that they would reject the Sandinistas in order to survive. That was the calculation. Since 1984, there has been no multinational aid, no international aid available to Nicaragua in any form. Aid has come from a number of different sources in tiny quantities and reluctantly at that. Those countries who in the first couple of years of the revolution, Mexico, Venezuela, social democracy around the world, Christian democracy, which supplied money to Nicaragua in the first couple of years, found that actually this business of international solidarity and international aid was all very well as a symbolic gesture, but it was proving too expensive. By 1982, Mexico announced that its cheap oil to Nicaragua would no longer be available. After all, Mexico had problems of its own. Venezuela, too, cut back on the basis of an absence of democracy, on human rights and so on, cut back on its oil supply. Less and less money was available to Nicaragua, from the big to the small, not only aggression, not only attrition, not only the refusal of aid to the blocking of any aid to any other agencies, but even down to the most minimal destructive acts, like, for example, that most hypodermic syringes arriving in Nicaragua come from the United States. Every single one of them arrived, consignment after consignment, broken. The seals on the medicine bottles were broken. The bottles of pills were broken. And they arrived simply to undermine and demoralize. There is no question who is responsible for this misery and wretchedness that the Nicaraguan population has had to suffer over these years. Who has been responsible for causing such pain and distress, for the reintroduction of hunger, for the raising of the level of infant mortality? The responsibility lies with the United States. But there's another fact that we have to face, and that is that misery, those statistics, that terrible sacrifice, that terrible penury imposed upon the Nicaraguan population, those general statistics hide something much more perplexing, much more central, and much more significant, and that is that misery, that sacrifice was not equally distributed. And that's, in a sense, the third factor we have to look at. Yes, there was misery. Yes, there was hunger. And yes, there was penury. Yes, there was war weariness. But the Nicaraguan population have for 10 years accepted that sacrifice. They have fought, they have died, they have accepted the sacrifices that war implies. They have sustained heroically a struggle against imperialism under the worst of conditions. They have done so, and they have done so and supported their own leaders in the 1974 elections, for example, with an overwhelming vote in favor of Sandinistas. But in the intervening 5 years, something else has happened. In the intervening 5 years, those sacrifices, as they grew deeper, have been visibly unequally distributed. You don't have to look inside the statistics to find out what that meant. You only have to take a walk around Managua. And you will see suddenly and inexplicably as you walk, what were called the people's stores. Well, they were closed early in 1988, but until then, they were available. They were supermarkets with subsidized goods in them. Those supermarkets with subsidized goods held a minimal selection of important basic goods sometimes. Most of the time, the shelves were empty for lengths of time. Toilet paper would be unavailable for 2 or 3 months. Toothpaste would be unavailable for 2 or 3 months. Even the staples, rice, coffee, would be suddenly and inexplicably unavailable for significant length of time. Yet not very far from those people's stores were other things. There were dollar supermarkets, which were a little bit like the supermarkets of Honduras, which I've been able to see, which are absolutely chock-a-block full of goods. 17 varieties of rice, 18 varieties of coffee, instant custard and blancmange to please an army of instant blancmange addicts. You know, these were available. Nylon, technology, new clothes, jeans. To give you an idea, jeans, if you could get them in the dollar supermarket, at $19 or $20 each. I mean, a pair, obviously, at $19 or $20 a pair. The wage of a teacher in Nicaragua is $20 a month. Just to give you some sense of what was available. Now, how is this possible? As you walk around Managua, it's quite surprising. You walk around the corner and suddenly, in among the misery and the wretchedness and the obvious scarcity, in among the austerity that applies to most people, suddenly there are wealthy houses with polished rosewood doors at the garages, servants lounging in the doorway, big cars, admittedly some of them a bit short of spare parts, but big cars nonetheless. Who were these people? Who were these privileged people who it seemed had been exempt from or protected from the impact of scarcity and the impact of austerity? These were the Nicaraguan middle class. These were the recipients and the beneficiaries of the often proclaimed, and it was most recently proclaimed on Sunday night or rather on Monday morning by Ortega in accepting his election defeat. Ortega said, we pride ourselves in our political pluralism, we are a mixed economy. And let's translate that into what that really means. A mixed economy means that the effects of the austerity plans, the effects of scarcity and the effects of the imperialist blockade do not fall upon the private capitalist class. That its interests are protected, that it continues to receive subsidy and support, diminishing sometimes, but subsidy and support from the Nicaraguan government. That middle class has been protected. Groups have been made available to it. It has been allowed to have bank accounts outside the country and inside the country, to enjoy privileged and special exchange rates, enabling it to continue to consume in the style to which it was accustomed. Not only that, in the last 4 or 5 years, and indeed more far from being a state socialism of the kind proclaimed by Reagan and Bush and the other North American spokespeople, has actually been an economy which has seen resources shifting back towards the private sector, as some 15% of, for example, the state sector in agriculture has moved back into private capital. 65% and more of the economy remains in private hands. Not just small farmers, peasants working with their families, but large farmers, large industrialists, manufacturers, bankers. Those who remain in Nicaragua remain there at the behest of and with the protection of the Sandinista government. Now, how is that possible? How is the reconciliation of which all the Sandinista spokespeople are so proud, the reconciliation between the interests of private capital and the interests of the mass of working people, how has that been effective? And the answer, comrades, is that there has been no reconciliation between them at all. What has happened is that the interests of private capital have been protected, and that the burden of austerity, the burden of want and scarcity, has fallen more and more and more upon the working classes of Nicaragua. And it has fallen on them in a circumstance in which, under the guise of war, under the pressures of war, under the pressures of a state of emergency, incidentally, which banned the right to strike in 1982, but didn't apparently stop the right to publication of La Prensa. Nonetheless, that sacrifice has not only, it has been generally accepted too, but it has gone hand in hand with a deepening restriction, an increasing limitation, the undermining and subversion of that popular democracy of which the advocates of Sandinismo are so proud. We have to confront the truth. Sandinismo, the Sandinista government is, as it itself said in 100 different declarations, a government devoted to the salvation of the national state, a government devoted to the protection of the national territory, a government devoted to the achievement of a national consensus. That national consensus has a meaning in class terms. It's a consensus in which the interests of the bourgeoisie internally and the working class internally are reconciled. And if they're not reconcilable, then one side's interests have to be suppressed, have to be sacrificed to maintain that alliance. It must be clear to us now, as we confront the loss in Nicaragua and the election defeat, that the interests that were sacrificed, those who were called upon to pay an unequal burden of the price, were the workers and the peasants of Nicaragua, the people who made that revolution of 1979 in the first place. They did so by accepting sacrifices while the middle classes were protected. They did so by accepting the destruction of the public sector and the welfare state, for which they had made a revolution, which today remains only in the rubble of a post-war Nicaragua. And that's the truth. And to confront it is only to tell the truth about Nicaragua, to recognize that long since, in pursuing that reconciliation, it wasn't simply an internal thing. That the politics of national salvation, the politics, if you like, of national development, have been a choice made by a political current, a political strategy pursued by Sandinismo from the very outset. Let's for a moment go back to 1979 and ask the question why the Americans were so agitated. Why was Reagan so distressed about the 1979 revolution? Why did his election broadcast in 1980 as Ronald Reagan came to the presidency of the United States? Why did he make Nicaragua a central issue in his election campaign? Because it was an enormously powerful economic competitor? Hardly. It didn't have any of its own oil. It was one of the most impoverished economies in the world scene. Because it had a huge army threatening the United States, well, despite the fantasies of the film director who made Red Dawn. I don't know if you've seen that. That's a film in which, there's three people it seems anyway, a film in which the Nicaraguans crept up under cover of night into the United States, invaded Florida, and before you knew it, Zappo, they had the rest of the United States. An interesting theory, but one not entirely supported by the facts, I'd say. Anyway, but that fantasy, that nightmare of the American right pointed to something in a curious sense in which Reagan and those of us in the SWP and around it would agree. And that is that the 1979 revolution in Nicaragua did represent something dramatically important. Not economically, not the foundation of a new state that would threaten the territorial integrity of the United States, but because it demonstrated that even in the most repressed, even in the most tyrannical regimes, even the most stable of military regimes could be overthrown, were vulnerable to the mass organization and to the disposition to struggle on the mass of working class people. The Nicaraguan revolution in many ways was the least expected. Salvador was a much more developed country in terms of its trade union organizations and its political tradition. There's no doubt of that. But what happened in 1979, in a period of recession, when the solution to the recession that world capitalism offered was a solution which involved the deepening sacrifice, falling living standards, structural unemployment, a sacrifice to be borne by workers right through and across the system. In that moment, the Nicaraguan revolution took the most stable, the most secure of all the military tyrannies, and overthrew it, not as the broadcasts and the analytical programs on the television in the last few days have suggested, by military coup, not by subtle alliances with external forces, but rather by mass insurrection and by mass action. The inspiration of the Nicaraguan revolution for us is the inspiration that is offered by a mass insurrectionary movement, organizing, struggling, and seeking and overthrowing a stable and secure US-backed regime by dint of unstinting and a struggle full of sacrifice, demonstrating that, in a sense, in one example, what we mean when we talk about the self-emancipation of the working class. The regime that took power, the Sandinistas, came to power at the head of that movement, but began to speak of it in a sense, how would they interpret that moment? The choice was available then and there. What happened on Sunday last began 10 years ago. It began when those who led that revolution, those whose banners and whose symbolism marched into the central square of Managua and assumed power over government and assumed the right to create a new state, did so facing two different political options. How would they interpret the impact and the meaning of the Nicaraguan revolution? Would they interpret that as meaning that this was a struggle for the right to exist as a national state in the concert of nations? Would they interpret this as the expression, of the most radical expression of an interest which joined all Nicaraguans except those most directly committed to imperialism, the middle classes, the lower middle classes? Was this the expression of a national coalition for the defense and creation of a nation state? Or was it the beginning of a revolution whose impact and meaning was much greater and more immediate, much more significant, much more direct to the Salvadorian workers who did take their lesson from Nicaragua and a few months later set in motion their own revolutionary uprising? Or the Guatemalan workers who immediately, on seeing what had happened in Nicaragua, took inspiration, took strength, and took hope from it, and began again a revolutionary process in that country, which had been in abeyance for some years? Was it most meaningful to the Mexican workers who were beginning to develop their own struggles against the impact of inflation and the programs, the anti-inflationary packages? Was it to be most meaningful to those Brazilian workers who, in their numbers of 200,000 and 300,000, occupied the metal factories of Sao Paulo, occupied the factories of the great industrial heartland of this new world economy, which were in Brazil, which were in Mexico, and other countries around what up till then had been called the Third World? That's where the impact, the meaning, and that's where the forces that would extend and deepen the Nicaraguan Revolution lay. But the connection, especially in a movement which had no traditions, which had no political traditions, only the strength of its own misery, the strength of its own determination, and the strength of its own desire and resolution to struggle behind it. Those who led that revolution reinterpreted that revolution in a different direction. They argued that this was the struggle for the right to form the state. Since then, in the 10 years that have followed, the Nicaraguan Revolution has sought peace in one form or another. From Contadora in 1983 to Esquipula to Sapua, in a long and continuing process of peace negotiations, the Nicaraguan government has sought peace with the representatives of other states, has sought the right to exist as an equal with other states in the concert of nations. But wait, who are these nations set out to stand as an equal with? Proletarian nations, revolutionary nations, or nations led by military men, nations led by neo-fascists like Cristiani or El Salvador? These are the allies, these are the people with whom Nicaragua has negotiated in past years. It has elected a policy of the construction of a nation. When asked, Humberto Ortega, the defense minister, said that the social revolution will come later. For the moment, we must consolidate a national state. So that sounds perhaps rational at first glance, but let's be absolutely clear what that has meant. What has that meant in terms of popular democracy? What has that meant in terms of the deepening and extension of the revolution in Nicaragua, carrying it forward until such time as the workers and peasants who made that revolution would become the masters and mistresses, the controllers of all their own resources? What has that meant in terms of those other forces outside Nicaragua, those other workers and peasants who were inspired and carried forward by the example of Nicaragua? What it has meant is that the Nicaraguan Revolution, the example of the Nicaraguan Revolution, has been progressively disengaged from their struggles. It has been progressively separated from their struggles. And the internal consensus between the middle class and the working class within Nicaragua, which has meant a greater and greater sacrifice for the workers inside Nicaragua, has reflected exactly a consensus sought on the international scene. It is that pursuit of a policy of national liberation, of national independence, which has meant that the years have gone on more and more clearly, not simply as it were a tactical reconsideration of the relationship between Nicaragua and the world and the revolutions and the risings and the insurrections of other workers, but actually a disengagement and a separation between the two. Late in 1989, in the summit meeting in San Jose, Costa Rica, of the foreign ministers and presidents of the Central American nations, Nicaragua put its name to a declaration calling upon the Salvadoran revolutionaries, the FMLN, to lay down their arms in pursuit of a peace process. They called upon them to lay down their arms in the face of a government whose military aid per annum from the United States is greater than its entire GDP, and which for 10 years has been devoted and dedicated exclusively to the military destruction of the popular resistance. How could this have been so? It could have been so because in suing for peace, in maintaining the internal and external alliance, the Nicaraguan government has set itself firmly on the road to national emancipation, national independence, and a coalition of national forces which has led objectively and directly to its disengagement to the, if you like, the separation of the Nicaraguan Revolution from the continuing and deepening revolution pursued from the struggle of other groups of workers outside. To save the Nicaraguan state, that state has been prepared to denounce and align itself with other voices in calling upon revolutionary sectors, insurrections, and the workers' movement in other countries to lay down their arms, to stand back from the revolutionary movement so that, and I quote, Nicaragua might survive. The result on the 25th of February this year was that the combination of want and misery and scarcity, of war weariness, which combined, I think, for the mass of Nicaraguans with a realization that this state from which they had fought, this sacrifice which they had offered, would not come to their own benefit, but would benefit those who, if you like, were the leading partners, the more important partners in the alliance that the Sandinistas had sought to build. Their national lives, their politics of national salvation had led them, even before the election began, to begin to talk conciliation with bourgeois sectors, to have talks with members of UNO and other right-wing parties, to ask farmers, capitalist farmers, manufacturers to put themselves on the Sandinista election list as they approach the 25th of February. I think that the third element of the defeat of the Sandinistas is that the Sandinistas, whatever they said to the international world, whatever they claimed to be on international platforms, had long since ceased to be the champions and defenders of popular democracy, had long since ceased even to pretend to be the defenders and representatives of a struggle for socialism. Instead, they were the constructors of a national state, but a weak, tiny national state, at war, under pressure, weak, and in the weakest possible negotiating position in the face of other states. Furthermore, a state which, tiny and weak as it was, had disassociated itself from any other state, presented itself independently as a state of the International Council of Nations. Whatever government was in power, there was only one way such a state could survive in such conditions, and that was by calling upon its own working class to sacrifice more and more and more in the process, in the pursuit of accumulation, in the pursuit of building and sustaining a national state under such conditions. Already, the Sandinistas have been conducting such a policy. They had banned the right to strike, they had imposed sacrifice. Their trade union movement at its conference in 1987, backed again by declarations from its General Secretary in 1988, had, in the name of revolutionary Sandinismo, called upon the workers of Nicaragua to accept wage cuts and to abolish, with a terrible historical irony, the labor code implemented under Somoza, which guaranteed and limited the working day. In order to sustain and continue and deepen the sacrifice on behalf of revolution, the Sandinistas said we must abolish the maximum working day, and we must abolish the automatic wage rises. But that call to the working class was not paralleled or mirrored in any cause to the bourgeoisie. On the contrary, their rights were protected, their rights were guaranteed, their profits were assured, and their right to exist was guaranteed by a proud Sandinismo which offered to the world an example of political pluralism and the mixed economy. But it offered it to the world, but its own working class, its own political base also saw and heard. For them, those 10 years of sacrifice and the revolution that they made at such cost must now have seemed worthless, and the Sandinismo delivered as a prize to the bourgeoisie the revolution that it had made in 1979. Let me just say for the next 2 or 3 months. They will solve the immediate problems of the Nicaraguan economy, perhaps. They will find the aid somewhere or other, I gather, by taking a little bit away from Israel. That's anyway the latest suggestion. Reducing their highest per capita international aid to only the nearly highest per capita international aid in the world. They'll find the money for a few months. After that, the Nicaraguan government will be called upon to inflict new sacrifices, new want, new penury, new austerity, as it turns to the international aid agencies, which will now gladly lend to the new Nicaraguan government, but of course on the same terms that they impose on anybody else who borrows money from them. Terms which involve further cutbacks in social spending, terms which involve more and more austerity, more and more scarcity, whose weight will fall upon the Nicaraguan working class. And in such a situation, the Nicaraguan working class will turn to that organization which has claimed to be its leadership in the past 10 years, in whose name that organization has presented itself to the world. And what will that leadership say? I believe that leadership will say, we must now wait till the next election. In the next election, UNO will have exposed its true face and we will win the next election. I know predictions are a dangerous thing in a world as volatile as this, but I think that's what they'll say. They have committed themselves not in 2 weeks or 2 months, but over the last 5 or 6 years to a process of representative and bourgeois democracy which would make Nicaragua acceptable in the concert of nations again. It has made a decision long ago not to identify itself with a deepening and extending proletarian struggle, not to take the lessons of the Nicaraguan Revolution as the lessons which are hopeful for the majority of workers around the world, and throw the extraordinary authority of the Nicaraguan Revolution behind the socialist revolution and the development and organization of the workers' movement, but rather in a suit for peace. The cost will once again be borne under whatever government by the Nicaraguan working class. What will the Sandinistas say? They will say, wait. They will probably use their influence over the working class movement to gain a place, or gain a cabinet post, or gain an influence in the new government. For us, looking back on the process of the Nicaraguan Revolution, we can never be identified with those who say, there's no point, it should never have happened, like Hobsbawm in Russia. Well, it's a historical fact, perhaps it would be better if it never happened. The Nicaraguan Revolution was an inspiration, was a beacon, was a proof that no matter what the conditions, the working class has a power which it can use, and it can express its struggle, and win even against the most obdurate of enemies. That's a lesson that we have to salvage, that's a lesson we have to save. The Nicaraguan Revolution was not about sacrifice in the face of the worst possible conditions. It was not about the working class being its own institution. It was about the power of work. We should rescue that out of this lesson. And if Sandinismo claims now that insurrection led to a social democratic alliance in a bourgeois democracy, in which a bourgeois democracy will impose upon the workers new and ever deeper sacrifices, then we should rescue from Sandinismo its revolutionary possibility and argue that the only way forward now is for the working class in Nicaragua to learn the lessons of its own experience and prepare to fight again against a new state which, whatever its name, will seek to impose sacrifice, penury, and the dynamics of a world capitalist system upon it. What is required now is what was required then. Learning the lessons of the power of the working class, the potential power of the working class, to build a struggle of workers, a struggle which sees its allies not in other states or social democrats or neo-fascists in government, but in the workers of Mexico, of Brazil, of El Salvador, for whom the Nicaraguan Revolution was then an inspiration. And we hope as the next Nicaraguan Revolution develops, it will be again a new inspiration, but this time incontrovertibly, not about building national states, but about an international revolution based on the experience of '79 and the experience that flows therefrom. Perhaps we should end with the words of Joe Hill, not to mourn, but to organize.
He declared, of course, our support for the Nicaraguan Revolution against U.S. imperialism, the Contras and so on, but he endeavoured to warn those people that the dangers that lay ahead for the Nicaraguan Revolution. Their reaction to that actually was not to answer Mike's arguments with other arguments. Their reaction was one of contempt. John Bevan, from the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign, when Mike was speaking, his summing up, demonstratively walked off the platform. Their whole argument was, who the hell do you think you are criticising the Nicaraguan Revolution? What are you? You've got no right to criticise, and so on. The whole attitude was to say, to raise the Sandinistas above a level of criticism. It was disloyal, it was unrevolutionary to say anything. All one could do was offer completely uncritical support. The point about recalling this is not to crow in relation to those people. The point is that if you take that kind of attitude, that actually in the long run you destroy yourselves politically. The point is not that I accept for one moment those people now to turn around and say, you were right, and so on. Long ago I learned in politics that by predicting that things would go wrong or by being right didn't mean that you put it to the test and then you were proved right and other people came around and said, you were right, we'll do it. It doesn't work like that. The point is though, that generation after generation of people on the left have been destroyed by this kind of romanticisation of regimes and raising people above the level of criticism. You know, we can look back, we can see the same was done with Vietnam. Right, when Ho Chi Minh died, Chris Harmon spoke at a memorial meeting, and he made some criticisms of Ho Chi Minh. It was regarded as heresy, disgraceful, you can't do it. Carrie Kelly denounced him in the press and said it was shameful to utter any criticism. Over China, over Mao, the same hero worship. You can't criticise, you know, you must bow down before these people. These people are immune to criticism. We'll see the same thing in relation to we see the same thing in relation to South Africa and Nelson Mandela and so on. The problem is, you do that, right, when the thing goes wrong, when you abdicate the right to criticism, when the thing goes wrong, you're left in disarray and absolutely shattered. The necessity of criticism for Marxists, for revolutionaries, is clear. We don't put anybody on a pedestal, right, and above criticism. Neither Marx, nor Lenin, nor Nelson Mandela, nor Trotsky, nor anybody else. And the reward for doing that is not being able to say, we told you so, but still being there, able to fight the poll tax, support ambulance workers, carry on the struggle, defend the basic ideas of Marxism and socialism, defend the October Revolution, and indeed defend the legacies of the Nicaraguan Revolution. That is the necessity of criticism.
Not only gobsmacked people, I mean, it literally floored and devastated, I think, a whole generation of young activists inside Britain. People who, you know, not only, you know, drank at Sandinista mugs, wore Sandinista t-shirts, you know, wore badges and drank Nicaraguan coffee at a point of principle, were absolutely crying into their coffee, you know, when they read the front page of The Guardian and listened to the right-wing crowing with delight on Radio 4 when they announced the election results. And we should be clear that actually that demoralisation, do you know what I mean, that we have to be clear about who the main enemy is, because people can then take their own lessons to it. They can say, well, really, you know, they did try and fight back, but they had no choice, you know, that really every time people fight back, it goes back into the action stuff. And we have to be incredibly clear in arguing that actually it isn't the fact that the Sandinistas fought and that it was a revolution in 1979, but that the main enemy is not only US imperialism, but actually the right-wingers who have been financed and backed, you know, by US imperialism with the Contras. The sickening sight of people who go around Miami, you know, saying, you know, next year we're going to celebrate in Havana. The Secretary of State who says, you know, in Washington, you know, 2 down, want to go, do you know what I mean, Panama, Nicaragua, now we're going to go for Cuba. Actually, it's those people who are the main enemy, it's those people who have undermined it, and it's in that framework you've seen that they're the main enemy, and actually I think undercutting a lot of what I think we will get, that demoralisation, defeatism, that the Sandinistas could never really do it, that we have to then take up our criticisms of how the Sandinistas actually managed the Nicaraguan economy over the last 10 years. And the fact is that we have to start off by applauding their action, and then I think in the framework of how John Molyneux actually structured it in terms of our criticisms. But I think the whole thing does fit in round about Eastern Europe and the death of socialism as people see it, because actually when you look at the way in which people undermine their whole belief, you know, that if you fight back, that actually again, it'll just go into reaction. You look at the front page in Marxism Today this month, you see a picture of Marx with rotten eggs and tomatoes thrown at him. You read an editorial which basically says Marxism's dead, Leninism's dead, Engels was a shithole, do you know what I mean, Trotsky, Yuski, do you know what I mean, all those sort of arguments. Actually incredible. And when you read back in terms of the way in which the economies, the both superpowers, America and Russia, have been under siege, I think that leads to more instability in terms of the Americans need to go and defend their rights inside Central America over Panama. Again, when you look at Russia, the need for them then to actually try and assert some authority inside the Trans-Caucasus. And that then, of course, does lead back into all the liberation movements. I mean, you can only imagine what it was like to be an ANC member a year and a half ago when Gorbachev sided alongside Thatcher, Botha and Bush by actually doing a deal in Angola and sending in the so-called UN troops. In other words, the South African police force to gun down liberation members inside Angola. Actually, when he then went to Cuba to say, Castro, I'm sorry, we want stability in the world now, we're not going to finance anymore, the liberation movements throughout Central America. And that has been one of the things, that one of the myths about Nicaragua that has been financed up to the hill by Russia. Actually, Russia's been cutting back their financing. I mean, if anybody read an interesting article in The Guardian last week, which basically, by Gerasimov in Russia, which said, look, we no longer really support these liberation movements. They've been chucked out of all the Eastern European countries in terms of having trading bases. Financing them has been cut back. We need the finance, we need the stability inside the world market, and therefore we're not going to feed in what is a volatile world now, where it won't be below those liberation movements in order to come up and to challenge the rule of the two superpowers. In other words, turning their backs on the people who have fought and died for years inside camps, inside countries, that have been gunned down in heroic national liberation movements in terms of a way forward for those movements. And I think that it must have gutted, to turn round to people who have, died for fighting for Mother Russia and for some sort of hope and gain. Actually, it's like getting your guts pulled out, I would imagine, in terms of a way forward. And so for us, therefore, we have to say that as much as we stand by, the heroic struggles of not only the Sandinistas, the gains of the revolution, not only the struggles and fights of the PLO, the ANC, the IRA, and all those liberation struggles, we have to then say that actually within that, and with the death, because Stalinism is basically being what structured those organisations, the first to fight for national liberation, then we'll talk about socialism. We have to hope now that the death of Stalinism and the crushing of Stalinist ideas by that revolt from below inside Eastern Europe can be the basis for us to actually hope that a minority can pull away to the ideas of Stalinism and start to actually rediscover the ideas of Trotsky and the ideas of permanent revolution. In Ireland, that's the centrality of the working class, north and south of the border. For the PLO, for us, it's the role of the working class in Egypt and Jordan and all those surrounding states. And for the ANC, again, it's the centrality of the role of the black working class. Again, for the Sandinistas, we have to argue that it's the role not only in Nicaragua but throughout Central America, a massively powerful working class in Brazil and Mexico and throughout there, and hope that then, that the death of Stalinism, as we see it in Eastern Europe, and actually the massive right-wing propaganda that's been made at the Nicaraguan election can hopefully be the basis not for defeat and demoralisation, but actually for a pulling out, if we like, to a minority, to the ideas of Trotsky and to the ideas of permanent revolution and the centrality of the working class.
Judy Watts.
We've got to look and see what the Bolshevik Party would have done in 1979 in Nicaragua after a successful insurrection. It would have nationalised the land and distributed the land to the peasants. It would have expropriated the bourgeoisie and smashed them. It would have instituted workers' control in the factories. It would have set up workers' militias to defend Nicaragua against imperialism. And it would have attempted to spread the revolution. The Sandinistas didn't do any of those things. And in fact, we can look at the tragedy that's happened, the waste of all those working class and peasant lives, the peasants who heroically fought against imperialism in 1979. The tragedy happened 10 years ago because a petty bourgeois nationalist movement led that revolution, and the result has been that imperialism has come back to Nicaragua.
Mike Simmons, socialist worker, so where we all are. I agree with quite a lot of what the last speaker said, but I don't think anyone should have any illusions that the Bolshevik Party in Nicaragua, that you could guarantee that somehow the revolution was going to spread everywhere else through Central America and into Latin America. It's a very small, poor, isolated country. But what you can say, what I remember from '79 really vividly, was it wasn't just Nicaragua, it wasn't just Grenada, the other great American triumph was rolling over Grenada, if you remember, but the world crisis that provoked revolutions there led to the what Mike talked about in the rest of Central and Southern America. It led to the revolution in Iran. It led to rebellions in the other Gulf states. A year later, it led to Poland. And actually at that time, when things were quite grim in Britain, you could look abroad and think, excellent, things are moving internationally. You can say, okay, none of that has come out particularly brilliantly today. I mean, hearing the Nicaraguan election results on Monday was particularly devastating. But once again, 10 years on, you look around the world and workers are still fighting, and hopefully workers have drawn lessons. I mean, if the sight of the Reagan and Thatcher and that lot celebrating the demise of the Nicaraguan revolution is sickening, then the left to go on about it being a revolution too far is almost as sickening, because I think we ought to remember what the Sandinistas did and what the alternative was in Central America. If it was a revolution too far, where they didn't have revolutions was even worse. You think about El Salvador. What characterises El Salvador? Not democracy in any shape or form. The death squads, poverty, malnutrition. It's something that anybody who said it was a revolution too far, you should chuck straight back in their face. What characterised Guatemala in the years after the Sandinista revolution? Exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. What characterises Honduras? The bloody Contra bill, taken over by the Contras, death squads, corruption, murder, all the rest of it, smashing of anybody who tries to fight back, and that's the democracy that they've got now in Central America. That's still the triumph of the United States. And for those poor people in Nicaragua who thought that they were going to get American aid from by voting for should look at Panama, because very instructive. On the same day that the Nicaraguan revolution, when the Sandinistas lost the election, the new American-backed president of Panama went on a hunger strike. Why? Because they're cutting the aid. They've destroyed the country and they're cutting the aid. And actually, what Mike said is quite true. They'll get some emergency aid into Nicaragua in the next few months, but it'll stop. It'll grind to a halt. And instantly, you could hear the American politicians say, where's it going to end? $2 billion for East Germany, $2 billion for Panama, $2 billion for Nicaragua. Where are we going to get the money from? They're not going to take it off the MX missile budget and all the rest of it. Actually, the poverty is going to continue, and there's going to be reasons to fight back. And I think Mike structured the talk very, very, very well in explaining essentially the impossibility of the Sandinista project. It's not that Ortega was a sellout. The project he tried was a failure. And I want to end on this last note. On Monday, trying to come to terms with the thing, I read some of the articles written in the paper, The American Militant, which for a long, long time have been a real cheerleader of the Sandinistas, completely uncritical, and actually reading the detail of the election campaign and so on, you end up feeling it's no wonder that the Sandinistas ended up losing it. That they were talking before the elections of a government of national unity. They were putting rich farmers who never had anything to do with the Sandinistas, in fact, they've been quite hostile at putting them onto the slate. They were talking about incentives for small business. The finance minister was boasting that their economic package was modelled on IMF economic packages for the rest of Central America, and that actually there'd been IMF officials there and given the Nicaraguan economy a clean bill of health, and we know what that means, and even talk of privatisation and also of opening up private wards in the hospitals. And we see once you start from the wrong position, then you systematically roll back and roll back and roll back until that's what the Sandinistas were offering. I think if you understand that they didn't start from trying to build socialism, build it on building a society on popular power, actually you can come to terms with the defeat far more easily. And then our job is, as John Mullen said, is to go around and look to people who had illusions in in Nicaragua and say, look, the fight goes on, it's fights worth having. The Sandinista revolution achieved a hell of a lot. It was a beacon of hope, and we've got to try and learn from it and make sure that the same mistakes aren't made again.
Pete Lee, followed by Chris Harman.
Yeah, I really want to preempt it some of what I wanted to say, when you talked about the Russian role in the event. I just maybe take it a step further. I think it's right to say, I mean, maybe Mike would confirm it for me, that when the Nicaraguans put pressure on the FMLN over there, what they were doing in El Salvador, it was actually the Russian ambassador who was involved in calling the representative in Managua as well as the Nicaraguan Sandinista themselves. Also, the Sandinistas wouldn't have been prepared to do it anyway. Clearly, the logic of their politics leads in that direction. But nevertheless, the Russian role in this is something which we should be prepared to expose. I mean, in fact, one can even imagine a situation in which they were prepared to give up Cuba as well. I know the Financial Times today actually saying that something like 15% of the Russian fleet is now tied up, actually, sort of ferrying goods back and forth to Cuba, and that Cuba owes something like $10 billion to Russia. And it wouldn't, it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that one can imagine a further deal being made by Gorbachev with the Americans as part of the range of deals that seem to be being made, in which they basically write off Cuba, as they've actually been prepared to write off Nicaragua, write off South Africa, write off really much of Eastern Europe. On the other hand, we also have to sign and understand a situation in which the American imperialism has won a victory, another victory. I mean, of course, there's a sense in which that victory was won some time ago, that they won their victory over the Sandinistas when they forced the when they imposed a blockade, they forced the Sandinistas into devoting whatever percentage of the economy, is it 30, 40% of the economy, to fighting the war against the Contras, when they forced the Sandinistas into pushing through the attacks on the working class. The Americans had already won their victory. But this has a further symbolic significance, which, going hand in hand with Panama and the aftermath of the Gulf War and so forth, indisputably, in my view, represents a strengthening of American power. But there are also, I think, therefore, when John Molyneux says we have to face up to an argument about, is revolution still possible? Is it possible to fight American power? That is actually going to be quite important for us. It's going to be more important for people in Latin America. And there, the argument has to be that yes, American imperialism has been strengthened, but there are limits to that. There are economic limits to how much aid they can give. I mean, I think, it's interesting. They're now being faced with demands for aid to, Poland, to large parts of Eastern Europe, to Panama, to Nicaragua, whatever. The truth is there is a limit to how much they've got, and they still have a budget deficit, although they've been able to maintain that for a very long period of time on the basis of borrowing Japanese money. They still have a massive budget deficit, and they're not in a position to do what they did after the Second World War and subsidise endless regimes. There are economic weaknesses facing American imperialism, and there is the threat of the working class rising up in Mexico, in Brazil, or whatever. And in the face of that upheaval, those upheavals, in the face of the power of the working class, which is still there, very much there in Mexico, very much there in Brazil, very much there even in a place like El Salvador, American imperialism is not going to be all-powerful or all-triumphant, necessarily.
Chris Harman, followed by Sandra Buchanan.
I just want to take up, what I think is one of the most important things for it, which is, in solidarising the Nicaraguan revolution, we also have to be extremely critical of the conceptions of the people who came to lead it. The people who came to lead it were typical of a whole generation of Third World revolutionaries who had this ideology that people coming from the urban middle classes could form guerrilla armies, and that these could then liberate countries with a lesser population. In doing so, their strategy always was one that the only enemy, not just the main enemy, but the only enemy which we felt overseas was American imperialism, or in certain cases British imperialism and French imperialism, and therefore to fight it you had to form alliances of all classes inside the indigenous population against imperialism. This alliance, and then once you've taken that, you then use the internal resources of the country to develop the economy and to try and develop a country like any other country. When you say a country like any other country, you need to develop the essentials of some sort of capitalist economy. Historically, traditionally, for the last 30 or 40 years, the pattern is took with the pattern she took in Cuba. You get control of the state power. You then, by collaborating with sections of other bourgeoisie, you then gradually eliminate them from power and develop a form of state capitalism. In the process, you never involve the mass of the population in the situation. The Cuban Revolution had the passive support of the mass of the population. It was not based upon a mass insurrection. It was based on the disintegration of the enemy army. The Nicaraguan Revolution, in some ways, the initial transformation of the conflict was even more marked because it was based upon mass insurrection. But the Sandinistas, with this ideology, didn't establish, they talked about popular power, they didn't establish genuine workers' councils. The workers who were armed at the time of the insurrection against Somoza were very, very rapidly disarmed in the period after. Power remained concentrated for the initial period in this body of 1,000 people, the Sandinistas. Only 1,000, a population of 4 billion. It wasn't like the Bolshevik Party even in 1917, which expanded until the Bolshevik Party had one worker in 10 as a member. It remained a very small group, manipulating the structure of the state, building up structures of the state, not involved in the mass of the population. The structure of the population in Nicaragua, you also see another structure. The same was become quite poor. It has become almost the orthodoxy now. You don't eliminate the old ruling class, you work alongside them. This is the strategy Joe's slogan of the South African Communist Party talks about now. You work with existing capitalism. You have some element of nationalisation, which the talk is pluralism, the mixed economy and so forth. But in this, of course, in both strategies, what remains clear, you don't involve the mass of the population. Having taken power using their pressure, sometimes using their heroism, once you've taken power, you govern for them, not representing them. You rule for them, you don't rule with them. You don't rule as a representative of them. And once you carry this past, the same as collaborating with national bourgeoisie, people should understand collaboration with the national bourgeoisie in a third world country is as bad in its own way as collaboration with imperialism. People think, we talk about the poor countries of the world. We forget the poor countries of the world include some of the richest people in the world. If you go to India isn't a country of people living it's a country of people living in poverty. It's also a country of people living in immense wealth. And the people living in wealth treat the mass of the population with even more contempt, even more disgusting behaviour than you find in the advanced countries. It's not true in the streets of London. People in Rolls Royces drive through streets full of people walking around, hooting their horns, and making people run out of the way in case they get run over. Happens in India. I haven't been to Latin America. I'm sure it happens in the Latin American cities. The contempt of the rich for the poor is even greater. You talk about alliance with these people, either the Cuban model, the beginning of the Cuban model, or the Nicaraguan model. You're talking about you're squeezing the poor to maintain your alliance with the rich. The rich put pressure on you. The Contra War was part of the process by which the rich put pressure upon the Sandinistas to make concessions to the rich. And the Sandinistas caved into that pressure. We have to be clear on it. They did cave into it. And we have to say, in the process, both models, neither model, either works. This is the most important thing. There was a period in the history of the world, from about 1930 through to about late 1960s, you'd seen one or other of these processes could at least achieve industrialisation of countries and building up the richness of countries, even if the richness wasn't in the hands of the workers. You have to say, in the present period, it doesn't work even in building up the richness of the country. And therefore you end up with a sad result of the thing. For me, the saddest thing is before the election, take Ortega was the great hero of the Nicaraguan Revolution. In 1979, no one said Ortega was the hero. They used to boast there was no leader of the Nicaraguan Revolution. You had the Sandinistas, and the top of the Sandinistas and the five-man group. They said there was no leader. The fact that one leader emerges is a sign of actually what's happening, the corruption, the inner corruption of the Sandinista regime. But then to see that one leader, the cowboy act, floating around. When Mike talks about class jeans, I remember the Sandinista adverts, the jeans in them, they were flaunting the wealth. The poor were expected to admire the wealth of the rich. And that is a sad result. That structure, I want to be a bit hard actually into the Marx one. When we look at that structure, we have to say they were trapped by American imperialism, they were trapped in their own strategy, or fundamentally wrong in what used to be called third worldist politics. The idea that you could liberate the third world by an alliance of the rich and the poor in the third world together, led by the middle classes, is complete rubbish. We talk all about working class politics, but for me, the Nicaraguan result is that working class politics is the only way forward.
I think, hang on a second, let me get my time. Just a couple of things on the questions that are coming after the end. on the role of the working class in the revolution. One of the arguments is that the level of unionization in the Nicaraguan working class on the eve of the revolution was very, very low. Those few unions there were, which were probably covered about 8 to 9% of those who were actually dominated by the organization, the PSN, which today is in the UNO coalition. The level of unionization was very, very low. And that points to something very important, a consequence of that, which is that the vast bulk of unionization, which today embraces about 230,000 Nicaraguan workers who are in trade unions, the vast bulk of them are in unions aligned to the Sandinista trade union, the CST, which, like the 26th July movement after 1999 in Cuba, waged a bitter war against the old trade unions and sustained a fairly sectarian attitude towards them, particularly the construction workers, who have been an important force and who were largely dominated by the PSN. As a result, that once the first strike in post-revolutionary Nicaragua was a building workers strike, towards which the Sandinistas adopted an attitude of absolute coercion and repression and extreme hostility, fundamentally because they were dominated by the PSN. An organization which has no revolutionary credentials, but at least, nevertheless, which identified at the very last minute, mind you, with the revolution of 1979. The other issue of what practically the exercise could they have done in 1979, I'll come back to that question in a moment. But I think, in summing up, what we've got to try and prepare ourselves for is the kind of arguments that we're going to read. After all, we can all agree, I think, that for many, many people, for good comrades on the left, Nicaragua is a devastating country. Why? Well, because they're embarrassed at having describing themselves as socialists and then finding themselves, for those in that tradition, having to be identified with the cold, grey, bleak and repressive regimes of Eastern Europe. The problem was solved. Here was a revolution which was tropical, which was friendly, which was beautiful, which was sunny, and which was led by young, kind of good-looking, young, and relatively clean people. I don't mean that entirely facetiously. I think that in a sense it was revolution made young, made useful, made acceptable, made clean in a way that for those outside the revolutionary tradition of which we are part, had real difficulties in identifying revolution with anything else. People in 79 and 80, of course they should remember, that in 79 and 80, many people, the Labour left, and many people, unallied people, were talking about going to Nicaragua. There was a lot of talk about international brigades. I distinctly remember having a tremendous argument with somebody at a meeting about why they shouldn't go off to join an international brigade, but instead should stay here and, participate in the class struggle here. Maybe that's an argument the communists haven't recently had quite so frequently. I don't recall, but on the other hand, the coffee brigades might have fulfilled that role. What I'm trying to say is that it was tremendously important, and that now, in the wake of that defeat, a lot of people, a lot of comrades who identified themselves completely with the solidarity movement, with solidarity politics, will now feel deeply disillusioned. A lot of people, in other words, are, as a result of this, I firmly believe, going to be lost to the movement as a whole. So in the next few days and few weeks, we have a fierce argument to have, an important argument. We have to rescue those people who identified in the Nicaraguan situation all that was best in the tradition that we stand for too, who identified in it the possibility of struggle, who talked about popular democracy, who believed what they were told about how Nicaragua was a society in which people were in control of their own lives, thought that a good thing, defended it for that reason. Our arguments would then have to be relentless and fairly merciless, and we have to say, no, the truth of Nicaragua was this. The involvement of the mass organizations were created from the state after 1979 and were fundamentally and throughout organizations of control and not organizations of mass democracy, not organizations of direct control. Let's be absolutely clear about this. The CST was formed from the state. The so-called Sandinista defense committees, modeled on similar organizations in Cuba, were created from the state. We're not simply conduits of state decision, but we're actually agencies of the state, operating at the local level, operating quite coercively, organizing people around the priorities and needs of the state. Sandinista leadership, in other words, saw in that structure of what we were led to believe, or many people were led to believe, were mass organizations of democracy. These were, if you like, organizations of control, extensions and development of the Sandinista state. That's what they were. And the politics that informed them were those of the leadership of the Sandinista state. It would be nice to be able to say the comment that after 1979 there was a bitter political struggle between a revolutionary current working from below through the organs of popular democracy and a current of, if you like, I think we have to call it Stalinism in a new form coming from above. That struggle didn't take place. Nicaragua did not have a revolutionary tradition, did not have organizations arguing the politics of Trotskyism, arguing the politics of revolutionary socialism. This was, in a sense, part of its tragedy. But the answer, and it's a tragedy not only to Nicaragua, but the tragedy as well to the revolutionary left beyond. You see, because, comrades say, well, people say to you, well, what do you expect? Do you think the Nicaraguans are going to go out there and fight the Salvadoran revolution or start a revolution in Honduras? What were they supposed to do? Export revolution? That's an argument we'll get, and let's kind of rehearse how to bang it on the head. You see, exporting revolution, internationalism, is not about sending little delegations of people out to train other people in how to use arms, or weapons, or homemade bombs, or anything like that. Internationalism is about the spread of an idea and of an example. An example interpreted and understood to mean that other workers can imitate and reproduce those elements of that struggle, those elements of 1979, which reinforce the strength, the potentiality of the working class to challenge and overthrow the state. It wasn't be like, well, this probably sounds terribly wishy-washy. In 1979, the Nicaraguan Revolution, because it turned the tide, because you see, again, permit me just to go back one further step. In 1973, there occurred the overthrow of a regime in Chile which had come to mean a great deal to the left around the world, but also for different reasons. We were bitterly critical of the reformist road which it stood for. But for 3 years, between 70 and 73, in Chile, the popular unity government seemed to legitimate an idea that revolutions could come by peaceful means along a reformist road which then would automatically convert itself into a revolutionary road. The result, as comrades will know, was that on September 11, 1973, with the cold and relentless logic of a capitalist system under threat, the state turned upon that movement and drowned it in blood. Now, two things from that I want to point to. First of all, there was a demonstration 3 weeks before that coup of 750,000 workers marching through the center of Santiago, the capital of Chile. They marched in support of the popular unity government. But there's an interesting account by somebody who was there as to the atmosphere and the feeling, the climate in which that demonstration took place. The workers marched, but already by August of 1973, a series of prior political confrontations had seen the state and the leadership of the working class movement systematically aligned with the state against the workers' movement, seeing the workers' movement itself as a threat rather than the instrument of transformation. So when they marched in their 750,000 through Santiago, they did so in an atmosphere of demoralization, they did so out of loyalty, out of allegiance, but having lost completely the hope that their movement had represented a couple of years earlier. In the rallies, as they were reported in the pre-election period, we usually forget, and I mean, Lindsay was unkind enough to point out to me that she'd asked me a week ago who was going to win the elections, and I'm afraid, like everybody else, I said, of course, the Sandinistas. All right, so what's that maybe a lousy profit club, a lousy profit. But anyway, everybody else said the same thing. No defense to this. Anyway, they did anyhow. But a year before, the Sandinistas themselves took a survey of their own population and found that not more than a third of the population of Nicaragua actively supported the Sandinistas. Under the pressure of imperialism, under the nauseating presence of the Contras, everybody has somebody dead, everybody knew that the Contras were in the vicinity, some inside Nicaragua, some massing on the borders. This last gesture of loyalty around the election campaign was undoubtedly that kind of last but demoralized and saddened gesture of allegiance. This doesn't represent what we want. Support for the Sandinistas is not what we want. What we wanted was a continuing sense of their own strength, their own capacity to continue the struggle independently of compromise, allegiance and negotiation with other hostile states. And that feeling had been lost. Fundamentally, that's the reason for the election result. The other common thing, but the loss of a sense that there was any other possible way forward. And that loss was actively pursued and actively the result of the Sandinista strategy. See, what were they arguing? When we talk about Stalinism, we tend to think always in terms of, men in long grey coats and Homburgs looking grim in a snowstorm. That's not the definition of Stalinism. It's a pretty good image, if that's what we want to put across, but it's not a definition. Stalinism is the argument that sees the state as the protagonist of history, that sees the arena of change and transformation as being, if you like, the limits and the confines of a national state. And that, if you like, the revolution will be the subsequent result of the successful construction of a national state and a national economy. That is what Stalinism means, and that, in that sense, there is no question whatsoever but that the task the Sandinistas set themselves was the construction of a national economy in the context of a world system, in the context of a world economy whose rules and dynamics they did not challenge politically. The consequence upon that is that the relationship between the state and the working class of Nicaragua was a relationship of exploitation, of oppression, and of control. Implicit in the Nicaraguan Revolution was another possibility in 1979. You probably ask, what practically could they have done? It's back to what I began by saying. What they could have done is thrown the enormous authority of the Nicaraguan Revolution. Any revolution, no matter how limited the terrain on which it takes place, no matter how limited the objectives it can itself achieve, a revolution has an enormous authority. I started talking about Chile in 1973, a workers' movement drowned in blood. In 1979, the victory of Nicaragua, for all it was a tiny, weak and relatively peripheral country, re-inspired a movement that had been deeply demoralized by what happened in Chile. The leaders of the World Communist Movement after Chile in 1973 said, this goes to demonstrate that the independent action of the working class and the achievement of working class revolution is now no longer a historical possibility. The theory of the historic compromise was put forward by Enrico Berlinguer of the Italian Communist Party in a speech analyzing the experience of Chile. That was the impact of Chile. Now, unless we're very, very careful, we will be facing a movement which today in 1990 draws exactly the same lessons. A new wave of people who have been briefly inspired by revolution and who will now announce its final and definitive demise. What we've got to do is disentangle the Nicaraguan experience, disengage it from that general assertion of the impossibility of revolution. But in order to do that, we have to argue with people who do not come from a revolutionary socialist tradition. On the contrary, who have learned their politics under the shadow of Sandinismo, who have identified revolution with the defense of socialism in a single country, who have identified class struggle as being the struggle between one national state and a more powerful national state, who have said that class struggle is about the Nicaraguan state, the necessity of survival of the Nicaraguan state in its contest with the more powerful state. It's almost as if, we expected capitalism to operate differently, that it had broken its own rules by conducting itself repressively and brutally against its own class enemies. How absurd. What we've got to do, though, is recognize that the comrades we will be arguing with have been brought up in that tradition. We have to, a very hard and extremely difficult and long task to resurrect, to rebuild and to remind them, to bring to their attention perhaps for the first time, that there is an alternative tradition. There is a revolutionary tradition that we stand for, which sees quite clearly that the central protagonist of the revolution is not a single state fighting for its survival, but a class. Now, what did the Sandinistas offer in the mid-1980s to revolutionaries around the world? What did they say about how a revolution, defined as they defined it, the survival of the Nicaraguan state, how was it to survive? When the NSC adopted after 1984 the slogan, Nicaragua must survive, what did they mean? Well, they meant, presumably, that it must find allies in among the bourgeois states of the world. That it must seek allies here and there. That it must see itself as winning acceptance and acceptability in the international continent nations. And the result of that was that it would survive in a world economy according to the rules of that economy. Was there an alternative? There clearly was an alternative. There remains an alternative. There's no alternative for the world that we just kind of wish into existence. It isn't that we wish there was an alternative. It isn't that our internationalism is a kind of moral position that we take about the necessity for all human beings to be brothers, about the necessity for all human beings to recognize their common interests. It isn't a moral argument, it's a political argument. We ask, what is the nature of the class struggle? Is it conducted in the national arena? No, it's conducted in an international arena in a world economy. That struggle is reproduced in each of the component parts of the world economy. The forces range, the bourgeoisie, when faced with its own class enemy, operates internationally. Now, how are we to respond? If in 1979, let's speculate for a minute. Let's say that in 1979, the Nicaraguan revolution had at its head a conscious revolutionary social leadership. And it's not about numbers. It is about the struggle for the ideas to lead that revolution had been won by a revolutionary socialist current. That current would have recognized that an isolated, tiny, weak economy was doomed to destruction. Furthermore, that even the combination of states within the rules and dynamics of the world system was also doomed to destruction. The workers' revolution had allies, natural allies, allies in the workers of other countries. And it would then have used its extraordinary authority in the world stage. It would have thrown its authority and its weight behind the ideas of revolutionary socialism, international worker solidarity, and the growth of an international movement. What would that have meant? It would have meant that it would have tied its fate unequivocally and without doubt to the growth, development and extension of the Salvadorian workers' movement, which it would have recognized as more advanced, stronger, and in a more powerful position in the region.